Halloween for Betty Speirs-Miller is more than just a holiday. It will always be the anniversary of the night she first had a hidden talent awakened by a very special lady. It happened nearly a century ago on Halloween night, 1904.
My first experience of Halloween still lingers in my memory. Most of the folks living then are probably gone. One lady will never be forgotten, as I remember her from the time I was a tiny child in a small town in Scotland. I had 3 brothers, the eldest a hero in my eyes, and I insisted on following him wherever he went, despite the fact that I hardly reached up to his knees. A girl, in the eyes of my brothers, especially such a small one, should be left at home. However, generally I tagged along, holding tightly to one of their hands. There had been a great deal of excitement in the family, preparing for Halloween, a very special night, as there was to be a party following the dancing class attended by my brothers. The pupils would have their usual lesson, followed by a party, and a ball for the grown-ups later on in the evening. I watched my brothers dressing with envious eyes, and realized that this was one time I would not be allowed to accompany them, as I was barely 4 years old. Nevertheless, I decided I was going, and that was that. It was growing dark, and the lamplighter was reaching up with his long pole, walking slowly down the street. In the distance I could see my brothers turning from time to see if I was following, but I stayed as much as possible in the shadows. There was a long, dark lane with no lights, and I was hurrying as quickly as possible when suddenly a gigantic figure dashed out of a door, dressed as a witch, holding a lamp in one hand and a broomstick in the other. In the flickering light, I saw a terrifying face with a long nose reaching almost to the chin. I took to my heels and ran as fast as my little legs would carry me, and finally reached the town hall where the dancing class was in progress. Opening the door a few inches, I noticed the boys sitting on long forms on one side of the room, the girls all together in a long row opposite them. It was a large hall, with a stage, the lessons given by a teacher dressed in a long flowing skirt, and what looked like men's boots, which were the fashion in those days. She played a fiddle as she demonstrated the steps for her many pupils. As she started a march, the boys led off, keeping time to the music. I could not resist the temptation, and followed the last boy in line, to the horror of my brothers and their companions. They were mortified with embarrassment. The teacher then began to demonstrate the sailor's hornpipe, boys still on one side, girls on the other. Naturally, I stayed with the boys, as my brothers were there, trying to pretend I did not belong to them. I knew there would be a great fuss after we arrived home, so I just tagged along at the end of the line, afraid the teacher would make me sit down. Much to my surprise, she gave me a lovely smile. Still playing her violin, she bent down and whispered, "You are doing well." Now I had added confidence and forgot everything in the pleasure of dancing and keeping time to the wonderful sounds coming from the music which she was playing. As the children's lesson came to an end, there was a real ball for the grown-ups, where the ladies wore long dresses to the floor. I was fascinated as their skirts swept under the seats where we each had to sit quietly. I had never seen anything like this in my entire life. The men all wore white gloves and patent leather shoes, which shone as they stood and bowed to their partners. Evidently, this was a practice session, as other couples kept on arriving. The door would be flung open, and a blast of cold air would enter the hall. As I looked through the open door, it was so very exciting. Beautiful ladies and gentlemen were arriving in couples after stepping out of a handsome cab. The driver, or coachman as he was called in those days, attired in a tall silk hat and knee breeches, would jump down and help the ladies to alight, as her escort paid the necessary fare, in all probability giving a handsome tip for this special occasion. Being a small child, I knew nothing of what went on in this big world, as it was an unwritten law that all of us children must be in bed by 7 o'clock, summer or winter. Darkness came on quickly in winter, and I would stand at the window watching the lamplighter go by, but very seldom allowed out as darkness set in. Naturally, it was like a fairyland to see all this for the first time. But there was even more wonders ahead. The grown-up couples stopped dancing. The teacher put away her fiddle with the words, "Come, children, now we are going to have refreshments." A long table had been set at the end of the hall, and Miss Burgess called out, "Each little boy must choose a partner and bring her to the table." I stood undecided, as my brothers were too embarrassed to come near me. I followed the last little boy, the smallest one in the class. Suddenly the teacher walked toward me. Now the time has come. I'm going to be put out, I thought. She bent down and said, "You love music and dancing, I can see. You look so happy now, don't you?" With my mouth full of cookies, I answered, "Would you let me dance just for you?" "But you have had no lessons. What would you dance?" I assured her I knew how to. By this time an orchestra had arrived for the ball and were seated at the back of the stage. Taking my hand, the teacher led me up a few steps to the platform and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a famous dancer to entertain you. She has come all the way from London." This was followed by great applause. I do not know what they expected, but as the orchestra struck up, I was alone and in paradise. Dancing with joy and abandon, the wonder of listening to an orchestra for the first time, keeping perfect time to the music, the steps seemed to come naturally. This was my supreme moment, and as the orchestra quickened, I realized this was the time for me to make a grand finale. Skipping once more around the stage, I spun round, lifting my arms exultantly, and finished with a deep bow, not knowing this was the correct thing to do. The applause was deafening, and cries of "Encore, encore" were repeated. Just then my mother appeared. I expected a scolding, as she had been looking for me everywhere. Instead, she put her arms around me and gave me a great big hug. That was the beginning of my dancing career, as the teacher offered to give me lessons the following year. She will be the youngest in the class, but this little girl is going to be famous one day. Many years have passed. This wonderful person is now gone, but she will never know how fresh she is still in my memory. I am now in the evening of life, have performed in many of the main cities of the world, but the sweetest applause was the first time I performed as a tiny child. That memory will never fade.
Halloween tricking didn't always lead to meanness. Sometimes we learned lessons we never would have otherwise. That was the case when Ray Brown was a youngster, and a prank played on a grumpy schoolteacher turned into a lesson he would never forget. Join Ray as he recalls a special Halloween.
Just after the turn of the century, our family was living in Oakland, California, a city just across the bay from San Francisco. We had a large family, Mother and Dad and us 5 children. I was the youngest of our clan, and I guess the most mischievous, always thinking up some sort of trick to play on the other kids in our neighborhood. Since I was the boss of our gang, I usually had my way, and so when the Halloween evening of the year 1913 arrived, the 6 members of the 35th Street Secret Six repaired to their clubhouse out in our woodshed in the backyard, and there we put together, by unanimous vote, our plan for a special Halloween trick-or-treat. And the recipient of our trick would be the grumpy old teacher in our public school who was greatly disliked by most of the kids in school. Old Mrs. Ingalls, our strict disciplinarian teacher, lived in a big old house a few blocks from our school with her husband, a nice man, and 2 younger sisters, one of whom had a boy by the name of Timmy. Timmy had been crippled by an accident when he was very young, and now at the age of 14, he still walked with his crutches. He was a likable lad, and since we lived nearby, I would often pass by Timmy's house, and we would sit in the backyard under a big pear tree, and we would play games, read the funny papers, or work puzzles, and otherwise pass the time just talking. And I liked Timmy, because in spite of his being a cripple, he was always cheerful and didn't let his trouble mar his good nature. Timmy never let anyone see him as I used to, a boy who would never be able to play and run like other kids. Although I disliked old Mrs. Ingalls, I always felt sorry for Timmy, who had no brothers or sisters like I did. So, on Halloween night, we started out to play a trick on our grumpy teacher, hoping that Timmy would be in bed. I, as boss of the gang, had laid down specific orders that under no circumstances was Timmy or his mother to be tricked. We wanted old Mrs. Ingalls only. So, after we had removed her front gate from its hinges, uprooted a few plants in her garden, used a candle to light on her windows, we started away, when all of a sudden we peeked through a front window into the living room of the big house. There was old Mrs. Ingalls, reading a book to Timmy. She was dressed up in a bright yellow and black Halloween dress with a big witch's hat on. As we watched through the window, she went out of the room and soon came back with a big pan. She and Timmy were having so much fun bobbing for candied apples. He was hugging her and so happy that we all turned away. To this day, I can still see a tear appearing in a few of my gang's eyes, including mine. Old grouchy Mrs. Ingalls wasn't so bad after all. After putting the gate back on its hinges, replanting the dug-up plants, and erasing the candle writing on the windows, we started to drift away when the porch light lit up. Timmy appeared at the doorway and said, "Hey, fellas, my auntie wants you all to come in and help us celebrate Halloween, okay?" Yes, that Halloween surely remains in my memory over the mist of long-gone years as the most special of all. And needless to say, after that we had great admiration and respect for that sour old teacher, Mrs. Ingalls.
Now we go back a half-century ago, when Arlene Shovald and her friends decided to see the Halloween witching hour arrive in the local cemetery. They wanted to know if there really was such a thing as a spook. What they found was more frightening than they had bargained for when a surprise appearance was made by the ghost in the cemetery.
Halloween dawned dark and dreary in 1952, just the way it should. But it seemed the sun would never go down. The Halloween party at school did little to hold our excitement in check as we anticipated this special night. My friends and I had planned this evening for months, designing costumes with odds and ends of old clothing. Only our masks were new. Early in the month, as soon as the Halloween stuff came out, we'd collected our allowances, birthday money, and the receipts from a carnival we had held during the summer and walked downtown to the J.J. Newberry store to buy them. The counter was filled with hundreds of false faces. They must have been made from stiffly starched and painted cheesecloth. They always got limp around the nose and mouth from our breathing, so we could never use them for a second year. There were a few of the rubber masks, which were just coming out at that time, but at $1.98 we couldn't afford them. If we were lucky enough to have money left over after buying the mask, we bought a noisemaker, and perhaps even a small bag of black and orange jelly beans or candy corn. Last summer I visited an antique shop and got a rude awakening as to how many years have passed since that magical time. One of those old-fashioned noisemakers, the kind we used to scare the ghosts away, was selling for $25. By the time Halloween arrived, I had practically worn out the mask, trying it on and imagining the wonderful, scary, awful time we would have on Halloween night. This Halloween was going to be really special. My friends and I had secret plans. First, we would trick-or-treat as usual, but the real treat would come later. About a half-mile down the road was a cemetery, and this Halloween night we planned to take our trick-or-treat loot to the cemetery, sit there among the tombstones, and see if any spirits really did return on Halloween night. Of course, Halloween was never quite as warm as we expected it to be. In northern Michigan, it was darn cold by October 31st, so we wore snowsuits, scarves, and mittens under our costumes. Bundled up so, the four of us fairly waddled along our trick-or-treat route. Fortunately, though, there was no snow. It looked like our cemetery adventure was still a go. Armed with flashlights and pillowcases to hold our trick-or-treat loot, my cousin Joan and I met our friends Donna and Gail just after supper and started our rounds. By the time we reached the last house on our route, we could feel the excitement like static in the air. Instead of turning to head for home, we kept on going, past that invisible boundary set by our parents, over the hill and onto the cemetery. The moon lit a path most of the way. Our feet crunched in the dry leaves that snapped like cornflakes under our feet. As we walked through the cemetery gate, the only sound was the moaning wind as it filtered through the trees, rattling the few dead leaves that still clung to the barren branches. When car lights approached on the hill, we dashed behind a huge tombstone. We didn't want anyone to catch us and send us home. Then, as if we were having a picnic, we gathered around the tombstone, shone our flashlights into our bags, and fished out some of our treats. Naturally, I picked the chocolate first. People gave full-size Milky Way bars and Holloway suckers in those days, and even 5-cent packages of gum, and sometimes a bottle of pop. "Let's tell ghost stories," I suggested. Joan and Gail agreed, and as we munched our goodies, we took turns making up stories or retelling true tales Joan and I had heard from our Irish grandmother. And Graham had plenty of them, like the tale told to her by her mother about the corpse who joined the mourners for coffee. The body had been laid out on the sun porch, and the mourners were in the kitchen when the corpse, apparently recovered from a cataleptic seizure, awoke to find himself in a coffin. "That can't be," Gail declared. "They'd know he wasn't dead." "Is so," I insisted. "My grandma told me." Suddenly we stopped arguing. We heard footsteps coming from the other end of the cemetery. "Someone's here," Joan whispered. "I'm scared," Donna added. "Me too," I said. "Shine your light over there and see who it is." "No, you shine it." "Okay," I said, hoping I sounded braver than I felt. But the light revealed only trees and tall grass blowing in the wind, and still the steps came closer. By now, the steps seemed very close. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Look!" Joan cried, pointing, and there was a white figure moving slowly in and out among the tombstones. When I turned my light in the direction of the specter, 2 eyes stared back at us from a face surrounded by a haze of white. Screaming, we grabbed our trick-or-treat sacks and ran for the gate. We were at the bottom of the first hill before we heard a familiar bark behind us. When finally we had to stop to catch our breath, Joan's dog, Pal, a white mutt about the size of a sheepdog, came bounding up behind us, tail wagging. Our ghost had somehow gotten loose and tracked us down, and he'd given us the scare of our lives.
Faye Craig Hughes and her family were tired of all the Halloween tricking that went on at their house year after year. They decided to teach some boys a lesson they would never forget in The Halloween Prank That Backfired.
For years, we dreaded for Halloween night to arrive. A group of boys who were acquaintances of one of my brothers would invade our neighborhood and work it over. First, they would use their mother's homemade lye soap to blanket all of our windows. It took days to get it all scraped off. After the windows were soaked, they would proceed to more bizarre acts. Outhouse tipping was common, but the prank they loved most was putting a paper grocery bag containing fresh cow manure on a neighborhood porch near the door. They would then knock on the door. When the residents started for the door, the perpetrators would set fire to the paper bag and run away. The unsuspecting person would be so startled to find a burning bag near their front door that they would stomp on it, splattering their feet and legs with manure. One year, Mom decided that we had had enough. My brother, Grant, who had a vivid imagination and was a natural storyteller, went to work on the plan. He began passing the story around that our house was haunted. He made up an impressive list of the strange things the ghosts supposedly did. The wildest part was that one ghost could play the piano very well. In Grant's story, we could hear the music and see the keys being pressed, but couldn't see the ghostly pianist. That part brought the biggest laugh of all. "Ha ha," they would say. "How funny. Who ever heard of a piano-playing ghost?" So the stage was all set. The boys knew that we had an upright piano that could be seen through the front windows. What they didn't know was that we had traded the old piano for a player piano. Players were not very common as yet. On Halloween night, we turned out the lights as if we had retired early, leaving only a lamp burning near the piano. We had a piano roll in place hidden behind the closed doors at the top of the piano. A blanket covered the piano bench, shielding from view my youngest sister, hidden under the bench. We didn't have long to wait until the boys arrived. One of the boys peered in and said, "Look, fellas, there's that piano the ghosts can play." They all burst out laughing. They pressed close to the window to get a better view. At that moment, my sister began pumping the piano with her hands. In plain view of the boys, the music could be heard, and the keys were being pressed by invisible hands. In fright, they dropped their bars of soap and made a fast exit. A few ran down the steps, but most just took flying leaps over the banisters, running for home. They were so convinced of the ghost story that they kept glancing behind them to see if they were being pursued by one. The next day, we gathered up the bars of soap and had enough to do our laundry for several weeks. One of the boys, we were told, burst into his parents' bedroom, white-faced and bug-eyed, babbling about seeing a ghost playing a piano. His dad got up and whipped him for lying. The boys never again bothered any of us.
It takes a lot of bravery to face a monster on Halloween night. Ann Kutch had that kind of bravery when she and her sisters were threatened. Still, her courage was not altogether welcome, even on the night of the bear.
My sisters and I spent our early years in a little Maine fishing village. We had 2 wonderful parents, an old station wagon, and an incredible number of dogs. Our daddy was a remarkable man, always doing something adventurous and shying away from anything that even remotely smacked of the ordinary. He had a terrific sense of humor and was especially fond of practical jokes. Mom had a good sense of humor, too, though hers was much more refined. Together, they helped us lead very full and exciting lives. We 3 girls got along fairly well, considering the fact that we were so very different. Kay, the oldest, was Miss Goody-Two-Shoes, though she was and still is a lot of fun. I, in the middle, was the filthy beast, and dear Sandy, the toddler, was a sweet little flower. I wasn't that nuts about being the filthy beast all the time, but it came much more naturally to me than anything else. I'd been taught that if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing well, so I put my heart into it. I refused to wash regularly, cultivated an excellent swagger, and generally acted rough and tough. We lived upstairs over an old store in a little apartment which always had a woodsy smell about it that was homey and comforting. We girls shared a bedroom on the 3rd floor, right across the stairway from a small room which was in the process of becoming a bathroom. We were going to have a proper toilet, real hot running water and everything. At the time, however, it was strewn about with pieces of pipe, plumbing tools, and so forth. The night of the bear was Halloween night, 1952. Mum had sent us all to bed, and she and Daddy were entertaining some friends downstairs. Little Sandy had gone right to sleep, completely exhausted from the excitement of trick-or-treating, the costumes, and the candy. Kay was sitting on her bed, counting her pieces of candy and thinking where to hide it so the filthy beast wouldn't get it. I was sitting on my bed, too, eating as much as I could and feeling more than a little sick. Mum had called up a time or two to tell us to put the light out and go to sleep. Suddenly, we became aware that it was very quiet downstairs, and then we heard it, a loud, vicious growling noise on the stairs. Kay and I crept out and looked. There, coming slowly up the stairs, was a great big snarling bear. Wide-eyed with fright, Kay ran screaming and disappeared in a flash under her bed. I was right behind her when suddenly I stopped. I heard myself say, "I won't let it get you. I'm going to kill it." I shot across to the bathroom and grabbed a piece of pipe. The growling was much louder, and I remembered shaking all over as I stood, just out of sight, waiting. It was over in seconds. The bear's head, monstrous and terrifying, came up past the last step, and I brought the pipe down on top of it with all my might. There was a very strange noise, most unbear-like, and I saw the bear's body rolling down the stairs. Kay came out to see what was happening and went running down to join the scene at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't move, awestruck by the enormity of my deed, and still more by what I was seeing. There were all the neighbor friends, fussing about while Mum was actually skinning the bear. Under the bearskin was Daddy, making moaning noises and rolling his eyes all funny-like. They carried him into the living room, and I couldn't hear what was going on, but I didn't dare to go down. It seemed like forever before Kay came up and said that he was going to be all right and that Mum would be up in a minute. I kept asking if he was mad. She said she didn't know because he wasn't feeling very well and wasn't saying much. Then Mum came. She checked Sandy, who was buried under her covers and had slept through the whole thing, tucked Kay in, and came to me. My tears started and I sobbed. I didn't know. I thought it was a real one." She held me a bit and assured me that Daddy was all right and I wasn't to worry. As she bent down to kiss me good-night, there was a twinkle in her eye. She whispered, "That was a very brave thing to do." That was many years ago when I was 8. Every now and again, at a family gathering, someone brings the tale to life. They say time heals all wounds, but I wonder. Daddy still doesn't like to hear about the night Annie clubbed the bear.
Finally, one of the most requested poems in the pages of Good Old Days magazine is a Halloween favorite. I don't know what better way to close this special collection of memories than with James Whitcomb Riley's Little Orphaned Annie. Little orphaned Annies come to our house to stay, and wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away, and shoo the chickens off the porch and dust the hearth and sweep, and make the fire and bake the bread and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when the supper things is done, we set around the kitchen fire and has the mostest fun a-listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins that gets you if you don't watch out. Once they was a little boy wouldn't say his prayers, and when he went to bed at night away upstairs, his mammy heard him holler and his daddy heard him bawl, and when they turned the kivers down, he wasn't there at all. And they seeked him in the rafter room and cubby hole and press, and seeked him up the chimney flue, and everywheres, I guess. But all they ever found was this 'tis pants and roundabout, and the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And one time a little girl'd allus laugh and grin, and make fun of everyone and all her blood and kin. And once, when they was company, and old folks was there, she mocked 'em and shocked 'em, and said she didn't care. And this, as she kicked her heels and turned to run and hide, they was 2 great big black things a-standin' by her side, and they snatched her through the ceiling, for she knowed what she's about, and the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And little orphan Annie says when the blaze is blue, and the lamp wick sputters and the wind goes woo, and you hear the crickets quit and the moon is gray, and the lightning bugs in dew is all squinched away, you better mind your parents and your teachers fond and dear, and cherish 'em 'at loves you, and dry the orphan's tear, and help the poor and needy ones that clusters all about, or the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. Well, that's all the time we have for these memories of Halloween, harvest time, and the lessons we learned in those happy days of yesteryear. This is Ken Tate, editor of Good Old Days magazine, reminding you to always remember the best, and God bless.